Okay, we can start. First, thank you all for being here to our book seminar about Professor Schmale's latest book. My name is Georgia. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory. And first, I just want to say a couple of words of how we'll proceed with the seminar. I'll introduce Professor Schmale and his book. After that, our coordinator of the Laboratory for Educational Theories will say also a couple of words. And then, Professor Schmale, you can also give your presentation of your work. After that, we'll have 3 blocks of interventions, 7 interventions total. After the first block, there will be a break of about 10 minutes. So first, I want to say a couple of words about our guest, Wolfgang Schmale. He was, until 2021, professor of modern history at the Institute of History at the University of Vienna. His research interests encompass European and especially French history, history of human rights and democracy, as well as the history of masculinity. He's also working in the field of digital history and digital humanities. He is a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts, the Academia Europea, and the Scientific Advisory Board of the House of European History in Brussels, which is an institution of the European Parliament. In addition to this, Professor Schmale has also held positions at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, Technical University Braunschweig, Ruhr University Bochum, and others. He was also an invited professor at Hebrew University Jerusalem, Panthéon Sorbonne in Paris, and Kliment Ochridsky University in Sofia. He has published and edited numerous works, many of which have been translated into Serbian and published here by Clio. To name them, History of the European Idea from 2003, History of Masculinity from 2011, What Will Happen to the European Union 2019, and the book that we are going to talk about today, History of Modern Enlightenment. Now I want to say also a couple of words about Professor Schmale's latest book. His latest work provides us with a comprehensive global perspective on the reception of the legacy of the Enlightenment. The study spans a history of reception of 2 centuries, beginning with Hegel and up to contemporary works, such as, for example, those of Jonathan Israel. However, Schmale's book is not only informative and insightful due to its comprehensive examination of the history of the reception of Enlightenment thinkers and ideas, it also seeks to revitalize the idea of the Enlightenment as a social orientation, or gesellschaftliche Orientierung, as the German title says. This revitalization is based on the author's insight that the Enlightenment comprises not only a collection of theories and ideas, but also practical experiences, experiments, and exchanges, all of which together constitute what Professor Schmale calls a science of life. The aim of the work is not only to provide us with an overview of both the positive and critical receptions of the Enlightenment, or rather the construction of the Enlightenment since the beginning of the 19th century, but also, and continuing this line of reception, to provide its own interpretation of the Enlightenment. The aim of this interpretation, according to Professor Schmale, should be to strengthen the historical link between the Enlightenment and our democratic identity, particularly today when this identity is placed into question. At the same time, this interpretation seeks to avoid the one-sided, or as Professor Schmale calls it, the naive image of the Enlightenment. And it does this through an exchange with its critics, which, as we know, have been there since the age of Enlightenment itself up to today. So again, Professor Schmale, thank you for being here. Now, I will give a word to Olga, my colleague, who will also say a couple of words.
Dear colleagues, dear Professor Schmale, thank you for joining us for the seminar about this exciting and inspiring book. I hope the translation of this book into Serbian will provide a much needed impetus for the research of the history of enlightenment in our country, since there is certainly a gap in research in this respect. We don't have many scholars studying the Enlightenment in the European context, much less the global one. Some notable exceptions are participants here today. We do have scholarly interest in certain Enlightenment figures like Kant, Rousseau, or the figures of Serbian Enlightenment, most notably Dositej Obradović. All in all, it seems we haven't been sufficiently communicating with our Enlightenment heritage in recent times, which is why I hope this book and this seminar may contribute to the revival of the scholarly interest in this period, which, as you so convincingly have shown in the book, has shaped our collective identities and still continues to influence and orient our worldviews and practices. Thank you once again, and I wish us all a good discussion.
Thank you. Now, Professor Schmale, you have the word. Yes.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here in this prestigious institute and for the kind introduction into the topic of this afternoon and the book. In my introductory statement, I have two brief points. The first is how did I come to this book? It's less an itinerary in research. This is normal for scientific, but some observations outside scientific research brought me to write this book. The second point is I will summarize some aspects, what you can find in the book, so you will see whether it's interesting for your own topics of research. And the third part there, I will take only one aspect from out the book concerning democracy, and this might be a matter of debate. So I start just how I came to the book. And one reason why I wrote this book about the global history, and I must underline it, it's a global history, not a European history of the Enlightenment. From the 19th century to the present day was a number of observations, and you can make them yourself and control whether I have seen right or not. In disorder, as to say, Enlightenment figures appear in popular publications such as comics and graphic novels. Daily newspapers, magazines, etc. around the world make general references to the Enlightenment and specific Enlightenment figures such as Voltaire, Kant, Olympe de Gouges, and many others. There are thousands of YouTube videos on various Enlightenment figures. Wikipedia has an article on the most famous Enlightenment thinkers in up to 200 language versions or more. So the peak is Newton with more than 200 language versions for the basic article. In the last few years, Google has been used to search, I take the example of Immanuel Kant or other Enlightenment thinkers in around 174 countries of about 200. So that's the average number of states we have in the world, in 174 countries. And the peak of the research is not in Europe, but it's outside Europe. In many countries, not only in Europe, architecture and urban planning inspired by the Enlightenment is still clearly recognizable today and continues to shape the public space. And at least Europe is full of monuments to Enlightenment thinkers. Streets, schools, and other institutions bear their names. Numerous publications deal with the topic of a new Enlightenment or explicitly call for a continuation of the Enlightenment. One example is the 2018 New York Times bestseller by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now. In the Maghreb countries, people refer to Rousseau and his theory of the volonté générale on social media during the Arab Spring, and so forth and so on. If you look closely, the Enlightenment has a strong presence in many media and forms worldwide, which can also be measured quantitatively. In addition, there is a very controversial debate about the Enlightenment today. In post-colonial theory, the Enlightenment is held partly responsible for colonialism and racism, among other things, as well as for an epistemological imperialism that must be ended if a state of decoloniality is to be achieved. It is said that the Enlightenment was ambiguous with regard to slavery and slave trade. These are some of the observations that can be made and which show how central the Enlightenment still is today. And not only in Europe and North America, but also in the global South. More than ever, Enlightenment is making an important contribution to societal orientation. When we are interested in the Enlightenment, so this is in singular and with a definite article, its history and its significance in 2024, then we should remember that it is not just about Europe and North America, but about a phenomenon that affects the whole world. In the book, I explain for many different languages how the term Enlightenment came about and how it became the name we are familiar with, the Enlightenment, singular and definite article. With a definite article, this is important because this is a very recent development in history. It's only after the Second World War it became, as to say, commonplace to speak about the Enlightenment. I explained Enlightenment practices in Europe, in the Islamic world, in India, and many other regions around the world. This covers the Enlightenment period itself, as well as the modern times since the 19th century until today. For a long time, however, the Enlightenment was understood less as an everyday practice and more as a philosophy. I dedicate a very extensive chapter to the question of how intellectuals have interpreted the Enlightenment from the 19th century to the present day. It is with Hegel, Madame de Stael, Tocqueville, Cassirer, Horkheimer and Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Habermas, Peter Gay, Michel Foucault, Jonathan Israel, and many others. These interpretations continue to exert a strong influence on how we see and understand the Enlightenment to this day. The long prevalent fixation on the Enlightenment as philosophy has meant that little attention has been paid to the practical significance of the Enlightenment in the 20th century. In the book, I show how people in resistance to totalitarian regimes during the Second World War sought and found orientation from Enlightenment thinkers. I show how resistance to colonial rule, for example in India, used the Enlightenment for orientation. I show what role the Enlightenment played in Europe after the Second World War for the establishment of democracy and for the shaping of European integration. In the present day, digital media are of great importance for the dissemination of the Enlightenment and knowledge about the Enlightenment. Based on research using Wikipedia and Google Trends, I can prove that at least 33 Enlightenment thinkers are of global significance today. Of course, you'll find more in Wikipedia and so on, but the criteria is a problem of its own. But criteria for global significance, when you adopt them, then there remain 33 figures of the Enlightenment. These represent different currents in the Enlightenment and range from Spinoza to Mary Wollstonecraft. Among them is an African philosopher, Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was educated at the court of the Duke of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, then studied and later became a professor at the University of Halle. And later he went back to Ghana, his native country. Among other things, he dealt with the discrimination of people from Africa and Europe in the 18th century. I give examples from online daily newspapers from all over the world, in which predominantly positive reference is made to the Enlightenment or certain Enlightenment thinkers. I give examples from the current intellectual debate on the relevance of the Enlightenment, such as Steven Pinker, whom I have already mentioned, and many others. A walk through the global history of the Enlightenment, as to say after the Enlightenment, that is from the 19th century to the present day, shows that despite criticism of the Enlightenment and contradictory tendencies, we have no substitute for it when it comes to social orientation and democratic identity. So let us have a look on Enlightenment and democracy in our time. So this is a special aspect in the book, but it's quite important. The idea that modern democracy, the rule of law, and human rights owe their foundation to the philosophy of the Enlightenment of the 18th century is widespread, and by no means only in Europe or the USA, but throughout the world, as evidenced, for example, by articles in various European, North, Central, and South American, African, or Asian newspapers. In the present phase of democracy's global regression, and actually there are more autocracies than democracies, it is striking that in some countries there are increasingly frequent calls for revival of the Enlightenment or the defense of the Enlightenment in the interests of defending democracy. Robert Darnton, for instance, entitled his article in the New York Times of December 27, 2018, so it's some years ago, I quote the title, "To deal with Trump, look to Voltaire. Advice from the Enlightenment." End of the title. And we can speculate, of course, that Robert Darnton necessarily must repeat this advice after the presidential elections in the USA in November. In the 19th century, democracy was not a word with positive connotations in large parts of Europe. Rather, Democrats were labeled radicals, and for a long time they were also persecuted and locked away in a fortress. Responsibility for these purportedly democratic aberrations was placed at the door of the proponents of the Enlightenment. Quite apart from the fact that this restorative and repressive political strategy was unsuccessful in the medium term, it actually only confirms the view that the Enlightenment and democracy are closely related. But how are Enlightenment and democracy related, and what are the consequences of their connection? There are very different opposing views on this, which I quote in the book. I take one example, which I give in the introduction to the book. A few weeks after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001, the philosopher Giovanna Boradori held discussions with Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida in New York, which she published in 2003 under the title "Philosophy in a Time of Terror." The situation required orientation, and she wished to provide some. In her introduction, one of her observations was, I quote, "Habermas and Derrida agree that the juridical and political structuring, international law, and existing multilateral institutions grows out of the Western philosophical heritage grounded in the Enlightenment, understood as a general intellectual orientation anchored on a number of key texts." End of quotation. Now, we probably associate key texts with, for instance, Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, Rousseau's treatise, The Social Contract, or Kant's Perpetual Peace, to name just three renowned works of the Enlightenment published between 1748 and 1795. Presumably, many will agree that such key texts gave rise to an intellectual orientation represented in the common key terms of national sovereignty, democracy, tolerance, the rule of law, human rights, the separation of powers, peace, liberty, happiness, progress, and some more. Boradori neatly summarizes a widespread view. She also stands between two approaches that lend special emphasis to individual aspects she has listed. For instance, in his 1083-page book of 2011, Democratic Enlightenment, Jonathan Israel discusses a remarkable number of texts that served as intellectual orientation or could do so today, while others, beginning with Robert Palmer's The Age of Democratic Revolution, the first volume of which appeared in 1959, have placed more emphasis on the practical and revolutionary aspects. Here, we might also mention James T. Kloppenberg's Toward Democracy of 2016. Kloppenberg traced ideas and practices from the 17th to the 19th century. Boradori's working grows out of the Western philosophical heritage, is in conflict, however, with a global analysis of the Enlightenment that focuses on its non-Western roots. In critical post-colonial discursive positions, the Western heritage is considered a given that is to be overcome. And this leads us to the field of approaches critical of the Enlightenment. Currently, criticism of the Enlightenment principally plays an important role in the context of decolonization of thought. This criticism continues that was voiced by Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment, written in the United States between 1942 and 1944. Insofar as it concerns assumed causal relationships between the Enlightenment and modernity. Colonialism, slavery, racism, and discrimination leading all the way to totalitarianism. The criticism of colonial thinking and its historical roots also plays a role in scientific research, and indeed to an extent that is where it comes from. Nevertheless, every argumentation, be it for or against the Enlightenment, wrestles with the problem that there was no such thing as the Enlightenment. Rather, the Enlightenment is a retrospective construct, the internal structure of which constantly changes over time. Not least, the canon of key texts is constantly in flux. For instance, female Enlightenment thinkers and women's rights activists such as Alain de Gouges or Mary Wollstonecraft or Etta Palmströmer, to name just three, have received increasing attention since the 1980s. The same holds for Enlightenment thinkers from regions other than Europe or North America. In the Indian context, one might name the two Rajas, Ram Mohan Roy and Sefotji II, who promoted an Indian Enlightenment in close exchange with Europe at their courts. Another shift in interests is denoted by the term Islamic Enlightenment, which emerged around 1990, partly in the course of studies on transformations on the territory of the Ottoman Empire. This term is not without controversy, however. In the European context, there has been growing interest in someone like Anton Wilhelm Amo. I have mentioned him already. Hence, the positions currently adopted and disseminated to the broader public with respect to the relationship between the Enlightenment, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights are very contradictory. In essence, the dispute is about democratic identity on both sides. So the criticism serves the question of democratic identity. Those who wish to decolonize thinking want to reinforce democratic identity just as much as those who wish to secure democracy by explicitly evoking the Enlightenment. All critics and defenders of the Enlightenment assume that its key texts provide intellectual orientation or either democratic or anti-democratic nature. With respect to the dynamics of practice, one can emphasize democracy's historical genesis from resistance and revolutions from the 17th century onwards, while the other emphasizes the considerable deficits of the same developments and their overlap with colonialism. Ever new disputes seem predestined to emerge from this contradiction. We can speak of the dialectic of the Enlightenment not in the sense of Horkheimer and Adorno, but also in the sense that in time of crisis, which are boom times for criticism, the Enlightenment is disputed particularly fiercely. Often there is insufficient recognition of just how present the dispute about the Enlightenment was and still remains in the context of great political dispute. And this dispute is a dispute about the Enlightenment with the aim of the enlightenment of the Enlightenment. But the real aim of this enlightenment of the Enlightenment is negotiating democratic identity. And I would like to put it even more pointedly, it is only this dispute, the enlightenment of the Enlightenment, that has always lent the development of democratic identity its dynamics. In the various times of crisis since the 19th century, reference to the Enlightenment serves the criticism with which the crisis is to be overcome, while at the same time, the Enlightenment is the subject of criticism because it is considered not to be part of the solution to the crisis, but the cause, or at least part of the causes. The problem of democracy is always present in this dispute. Without this historical disputational constellation, there would be no democratic identity. Or to put it in another way, in countries where such a dispute is lacking or only weakly manifested, democratic identity may be in bad shape. The book ends with the last chapter, where I try to give an answer to this problematic of critique, criticism, and positive reaction to the Enlightenment, but I will not tell it now.
Thank you, Professor Schmale, for your introductory remarks and presentation, as well as an excellent summary of some of the main points of your work. Now we will transition to our first block of interventions. We'll have 3 speakers. Our first speaker will be Slobodan Markovic he's a professor at the Institute of Political Sciences. Our second speaker is Olga Nikolic, a research fellow at the Institute here. And our final speaker of the first block is Natasha Schmelz, a research associate here at the Institute. So, Professor Markovic, please.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, Professor Schmale. I have entitled my presentation of the book, A Comprehensive History of the Reception of the Enlightenment. The book by Professor Schmale, which I would translate into English, societal positioning. I think positioning is because we position ourselves in English when we want to say about certain things. So, but whatever, social orientation, social positioning, history of the Enlightenment in the global New Age. And I should also say that in Serbian translation, there should be quotation marks because it's about Enlightenment as a process, social process, not Enlightenment as a cultural movement and philosophical and political, in a certain sense, movement of the 17th and the 18th century. But we have also additional problem in Serbian that we cannot use, like in English and German, definite articles, which do not have, so that's additional problem. So perhaps this is what we can do. Anyway, the book is a comprehensive guide on the global reception of the Enlightenment and the philosophy of the Enlightenment in the previous 220 or a little bit more years. This book, and I will say something about the method that intellectual historians can use, and perhaps it's not so clear immediately, but this book is a result of 40 years of very dedicated research and very important scholarly works of Professor Schmale. They are all integrated here to approach history of the reception of a philosophical and cultural movement that is continental and global and that has influenced cultural, social, and political history of the movement which in the last 2 centuries has served both to justify, sanctify, and solidify basic cultural and political foundations of modern world, but also to oppose and reject them. One needs to be a historian with a multi-perspective and rather comprehensive approach. This means that the historian dealing with this phenomenon needs to be an expert in modern European political, cultural, and social history, but also an expert in global history, history of cultural transfers, history of civil society and education, and history of some particular concepts, including liberalism, pacifism, secularism, cosmopolitanism, racism, gender issues, just to name a few. Offers 40 years of dealing with cultural and political histories of France, Germany, and Europe. His titles in gender studies, cultural transfer, the history of the Enlightenment, the history of human rights associations, and Freemasonry helped him to develop this comprehensive approach. So without it, he couldn't really take this whole subject fully. In terms of his predecessors, and he mentioned some of them in the part of the book entitled Intellectuals, I think that Peter Gay had similar scope of interests. It is only that Gay implemented his comprehensiveness in the fullest sense, not in the book that is quoted here, his 2 or 3 books, depending how you look at it, on the Enlightenment, but in his second series of 5 books on Victorian society, entitled From Victoria to Freud, which was the second subject of his interest. And similarly, both authors, Professor Schmale and Peter Gay, used their knowledge of the 18th century to analyze the 19th century, in this case, the 20th century happenings as well. History of the Enlightenment in the Global Age is a real catalogue and guide to different interpretations of the Enlightenment. Unavoidably, a history dealing with an issue that has become ideologically loaded and a part of current cultural and identity wars, one needs to discuss left liberal, leftist, and post-colonial criticism of this epoch. The author is quite open in his assessment, and when post-colonial criticism contributed to the fuller understanding of the Enlightenment, he endorses and further elaborates arguments of post-colonial critique. When, however, authors like, for instance, Edward Said, reduce various streams of the Enlightenment to a single stream that serve the purpose for their kind of criticism, the author did not avoid to analyze such shortcomings as well. Findings of the author in this and previous books are anti-Eurocentric, post-colonial, and very critical of the legacy of hegemonic masculinity. But his critique is nuanced, based on sources, and with references to various ambiguities, ambivalences, and contexts that led to the emergence of these concepts. This means that multi-perspective and comprehensive use of history by intellectual historians do not only help them to be inclusive in analyzing certain phenomena, but also to see shortcomings of those intellectual historians, scholars, and philosophers who, in their criticism, selectively took some elements of the phenomenon that they analyzed and decided to neglect other aspects of the phenomenon that did not support their argument. Of course, this couldn't be done without 40 years of previous research. There are many important and far-reaching findings and insights in this book. I will limit myself to 2 of them. The first one is that there is a globalized history of the Enlightenment. Separate case studies have proven that regional branches of the Enlightenment emerged outside of Europe, emerged in Africa and Asia, concomitantly with European Enlightenment. In Africa, as was mentioned, in Ethiopia, actually Ghana was mentioned, but also Ethiopia. It's exemplified in the work of Zara Jacob in the 17th century, or already mentioned Anton Wilhelm Amo in the Netherlands and Ghana. In Asia, the Enlightenment emerged in Tanjavur in India, or Tanjore, at the court of Sir Fojo II, or in China, or in the 18th century Ottoman Empire. One needs to have an approach which critically analyzes Eurocentric layers in European and American historiographies to get better insights into this phenomenon. And the author has exactly been equipped to do it, and has done it, and has tried to integrate various case studies into one mega picture of the globalized Enlightenment. This mega picture, as the author acknowledges, is only emerging. So he has given a picture of an emerging view of this globalized Enlightenment, and of course, he himself asked other historians to further contribute and elaborate this concept. This is linked with other findings that refute Paul Kennedy's analysis, although he is not specifically mentioned, who claimed that the New Age was the age of European domination fully, which is not, it doesn't mean that we should understand Paul Kennedy in Eurocentric terms, because his book also In one way, it's challenged Eurocentric view, in other ways endorsed. But the point is that in the early New Age, there was no European political domination, which was generally held belief among international historians until recently. The author also identifies Eurocentrism of the Enlightenment in Europe, coming dominantly from the so-called systemic thinking that essentially limited enlighteners in their universalism. And the author already in his book, also translated into Serbian, The History of Masculinity, pointed out that the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen could also be read, he repeats it here as well, the Declaration of the Rights of the Male and the Citizen. That would perhaps be more correct. Another element that the author probably reached from his studies of cultural transfer, where I had an honor to collaborate with Professor Schmale, is that transfer is never a process in which one side only sends information and the other only receives it. Even a totally dominant side in terms of power may be partially changed in the process of cultural transfer. Iroquois Indians mentioned in this book are one example where their federative structure may have influenced future federative structure of the United States. Moreover, in local applications, transfer is usually realized in the forms of accommodations, hybridizations, appropriations, and adaptations. This, coupled with Eurocentrism, often makes it difficult for historians to see the scope of Europeanization, to see the scope of cultural transfer, or in this case, to see that the Enlightenment had its own regional non-European developments. I see this book as a huge encouragement to look for such local applications. And if we look them through hybridizations, accommodations, we will see even huger scopes of the Enlightenment. Using Jasper's term, the axial age, one can even speak of a form of globalized Enlightenment in the period of antiquity. This brings us to another call of the author, voiced at the end of the book. I will quote it. If the epoch of the Enlightenment is understood as a particularly intensive phase of a long-standing process of enlightening that began in antiquity as a referential period, then there are numerous reasons to analyze this process to the full extent in other parts of the world, which, in line with this theorem, Jasper's theorem, were included in the ancient axial age. From this comes a particularly global history of the Enlightenment. The second very big issue that the author has put before us and has already very much referred to in his own introductory discussion is legacy of the Enlightenment. The legacy of the Enlightenment, whether someone likes it or not, in the previous 120 years, has been inseparably linked with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, even if the Enlightenment could not reach these ideals in the period when it was a movement, and even if they were not reached in many European countries by the end of the 19th century. This inseparable link was constructed only gradually. As the author points out, the basic idea, one of the basic ideas of the Enlightenment, that all the kids should attend at least primary school, was only approximately realized only at the end of the 19th century, so 100 years after the end of the Enlightenment as a movement. However, the realization of certain aims of the Enlightenment, such as this wide education, accelerated this link between democracy, human rights, and Enlightenment. And in making this link, and this is where his analysis of human rights groups and Freemasonry is so important, the spread of associations played a key role in the dissemination and rephrasing, reshaping of the ideas of the Enlightenment. After 1900, networks of those associations did it. And it's similar to the way how the Enlightenment itself was spread through networks of Freemasonry and circles of the Age of Revolution, and then continuing with Freemasonry and Human Rights Association of the Third Republic and concomitant associations elsewhere in Europe since the early 20th century. A new way of internationalism personified in the United Nations, UNESCO, and European integration, and again linked the Enlightenment with democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. But what is important is that during the process of decolonization, political exponents of this process, meaning political activists in Africa, in Asia, India, and elsewhere, did not criticize the Enlightenment, but actually took many concepts of the radical Enlightenment in particular as a guide for their national liberation. As Professor Schmale indicates, Mustafa Kemal Pasha Atatürk opened this stream by linking modernization of modern Turkey with Enlightenment, although he voiced this identification in a country that was never a colony, so this is not a post-colonial situation. But then Ho Chi Minh, India, Algeria, and many others followed the example. This leads us to a surprising conclusion, which Professor Schmale didn't voice this way. I will voice it a little bit differently. That radical post-colonial criticism of the Enlightenment is often voiced on behalf of the former colonized world and not by the former colonized world itself. In post-colonial states, actually, and these examples from Wikipedia are telling, Enlighteners are still often used as inspiration, and they are also read and analyzed in that way, and they make much less controversy than in whatever can be called Euro-Atlantic world. And this brings us to his overall conclusion. How does the author see the result of more than 200 years of reception of the Enlightenment project? He summarized it at one point through the further claim. Essential contents, values, and perspectives of the future may still be drawn from the enlightening of the Enlightenment of Klärung, der Aufklärung, because during the course of the last 250 years, it turned out to be an endless source about worldviews out of which positionings or orientations are developed. This brings us to something that Olga just raised. This global history of the notion of the Enlightenment and its spread points out that enlighteners existed during the 19th and 20th century in the Ottoman Empire, India, China, Japan, and elsewhere. But as the author states, those enlightenments of the 19th and 20th century, enlightenments under quotation mark, should be considered separately from the Enlightenment of the 18th century and its global appearance, since they are essentially identical with modernization. And here comes the problem in Serbia's case. The Lexicon of Serbian Enlightenment, published in 2009, lists 129 names. There are 129 names of Serbophone Enlightenment, of authors who contributed with their work to the Serbian branch of Enlightenment. The list overwhelmingly refers to Habsburg Serbs, almost exclusively, to Baroque encyclopedists and Josephinists. But what about the Enlightenment in the Ottoman Empire? And of course, Dositej is someone who played both roles. He was a Habsburg Serb, but he ended up in Serbia, and even as the Minister of Education at the end. So the book of Professor Schmale opens quite new dilemmas about periodization of the Enlightenment in Serbia proper. Should, for instance, activities of Dimitrije Davidovic, a follower of Dositej in Serbia, be considered as enlightenment under quotation mark, or the Enlightenment, the continuation of Dosithei's work, because he's his disciple who directly implements what we heard from Dosithei in Serbia between 1825 and 1835. In line with this idea of globalized enlightenment, there are other issues. However, these enlightenments that were realized in various Balkan vernaculars, so Greekophone enlightenment, which was not even in vernacular, but okay, then Serbian enlightenment, which was in vernacular, Vlach Romanian enlightenment, how were they connected? And then, how did elements of the Ottoman Enlightenment or the influence of Napoleon in Egypt affect Greekophone enlightenment? And is Greekophone enlightenment a missing link between the Ottoman and French enlightenments? These are the questions that come to my mind from this book. They need to be researched. We don't have answers yet, but there is a growing number of experts dealing with this topic. Professor Schmale mentions 10,000 experts worldwide dealing with the Enlightenment. We have in Greece and Serbia like several, like 2 dozens, but there are people dealing with that increasing number. Another thing is that in terms of the reception of the word, because this is very much debated here, the word prosvetiteljstvo appeared in Serbian only in the 1920s and became used in the 1930s in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. But the word prosvetitelj, enlightener, was a bit older, but was actually applied to Saint Sava, not to Dosithei. To Dosithei only in 1905. And this links us with the fact that societies in the Balkans did not develop ideas parallelly with Europe, but first they developed them with certain delay. So Trajan Stojanovic, in his famous book Balkan Worlds, he states that in the 1890s, for the first time ever, Balkans, nascent Balkan independent states and their societies developed something parallelly with European mainstream. And he takes one Romanian author, Alexandru Xenopol, and one author from Serbia, Božidar Kovačević, as elements of this individualization of those societies. But these were exceptions. A real parallelism happened maybe with young Bosnia and then in 1920s and 1930s. And of course, emergence of Serbian literary herald is another science, and not before the beginning of the 20th century. That's why also this word was delineated a little bit late, but we see from the book that also in Dutch it was delineated rather late, about 1900. I think about 1900. And final remarks. To conclude, this book gives a real guide to some of the hottest and most contested issues in the contemporary world. It encourages us to think, why are monuments to the canonizers of eternal peace, Immanuel Kant, today candidates for demolishment? To think about how and why did Enlightenment, under quotation marks, become a science of life? So this Enlightenment reshaped, fused with democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. How did that Enlightenment become a science of life? And if there is today any viable humanistic alternative to it, there are of course alternatives, but is there a viable humanistic alternative to it? There is one very far-reaching conclusion in this book. The repertoire of political offers, when the main points of enlightenment are eliminated, serves to support one or other form of repressive political systems. And that is a theme to which Professor Schmale returns in several paragraphs. Finally, debasing and deconstructing the Enlightenment is a constituent part of it. Only some ancient Greek and Roman philosophers offered something similar, that within the movement you need to debase the movement. Enlightenment was the first movement that made criticism of all the institutions an essential prerequisite for understanding the world. My reading of the implications of this book, although it has not been exactly voiced this way by the author himself, is that Horkheimer and Adorno, their critique is even more a child of the Enlightenment than Peter Gay's and Robert Palmer's endorsements of the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution. We live at a moment when modernity and anti-modernity are in an extreme clash, as never before in post-World War II world. The clash is equally present in as different countries as the United States, France, Italy, Russia, India, or Serbia. And this book is a guide through a very crucial element of modernity. It is a guide to the construction of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law as widely accepted pillars of late modern democratic states. It is a very detailed and convincing analysis how these terms were coupled with the notion of the Enlightenment. The book has a title, Societal Positioning, Societal Orientation. It is about positioning, base points, orientations, directions, whatever one may translate orientierung into English. It is not ideologically neutral, as after all no analysis can be. This is the reason why this book is likely to cause discussions in very divided societies like Serbian, but also to serve those of humanistic, cosmopolitan, and pacifist orientations to reconsider and solidify their positions. Allow me at the end to mention that this is the fourth book, as was already mentioned, Professor Schmale translated into Serbian, thanks to the publishing house Clio, and the fourth book in this century translated from his huge collection of books. And this probably ranks him as the most translated historian and one of the most translated authors in humanities from the area of German language in Serbia. I don't know any other example. My cordial congratulations to the publisher Clio for selecting this book, to the author who has helped the publisher to issue it in Serbian, and also to the author who is always ready to come and present his findings in Southeast Europe, in Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Markovic. Comprehensive comments. Professor Schmale, after each block, you will have an opportunity to respond to comments. Okay, our next speaker is Olga Nikolic. Olga, please.
Thank you. Let me start with a general impression on the book. One of the most significant contributions of this book is that it gives an extensive overview of the receptions of the Enlightenment heritage, highlighting the ambivalences and the complexities in interpretations of what Enlightenment is, the difficulties in defining its spatial and temporal boundaries, as well as in evaluating its contributions and consequences. The points of disagreement in the debate about the Enlightenment are particularly fascinating. For example, on the significance of the French Revolution, or with respect to the mutual influences between certain parts of Europe, primarily between England, France, and Germany, as well as globally, between continents. There is also the question of positioning certain ambivalent figures like Rousseau. These disagreements on which you focus really show the complexity of the question, whose answer is often taken for granted, namely, what is the Enlightenment, or even whether we have more than one Enlightenment, as Professor Markovic also mentioned. I think you managed to outline a viable answer to this elusive problem and to demonstrate that the Enlightenment understood as a unity within plurality is still alive, that it is still relevant, and that it does indeed function as an orientation, especially for the political institutions such as the EU and the UN, the governments of contemporary republics, but also educational institutions, and through them, the Enlightenment heritage becomes part of common knowledge and our shared culture. Yet, for all the optimism of your book, I couldn't help wondering whether the Enlightenment is somewhat weak an orientation in the age of global disorientation. The Enlightenment ideals are endangered by the forces of counter-enlightenment, as you yourself mentioned. You point out that there is no unquestionable dominance of positive valuation of Enlightenment ideals and thinkers. There are right-wing conservative forces on the rise. Further, it seems that there is a sort of bankruptcy of the political bearers of the Enlightenment ideals, who have in some sense turned them into a lie. I have in mind the hypocrisy of invoking these ideals in contemporary Western societies. The hypocrisy mentioned by Zizek, for example, in his recent commentary on the attitude of Western politicians towards Julian Assange. The hypocrisy which is also exemplified in military interventions, in the increase of inequality, as demonstrated by Thomas Piketty's research, in the concentration of power and capital in the hands of a minority, in the ecological crisis, etc. In many respects, the system that we live in does not seem to work according to the Enlightenment principles of democracy, equality, human rights, etc. Freedom as individual autonomy is preserved in capitalism, but reinterpreted mainly in terms of freedom to own property and to trade, and detached from fraternity, the solidarity between human beings. This opens the question of the relative impact of the Enlightenment ideals today when compared to the impact of the counter-Enlightenment. The second relevant question regarding the extent to which the Enlightenment serves as an orientation today concerns the postmodern criticism of the Enlightenment. It seems that you accept the viability of these critiques, although you do point out that they should be directed more to the 19th century rather than the 18th century. Do you think that the postmodern thinking completely moves away from the Enlightenment, that it is another counter-Enlightenment force, or does it also preserve some of the Enlightenment ideals? And more broadly, is it a disorienting force, or is it also an orienting force? You seem to place it in a rather marginal position, yet it seems to me that these postmodern critiques are indeed reaching broad audiences via the new media of communication, and that they too are influencing both the public institutions as well as the private ones, for example, companies. There are rules against discrimination respecting different identities. There is a stress on diversity and individuation rather than on the unity and cohesion of the social body. All this is closely connected precisely with the critique of the Western rationalism. So there is a complex relation between the Enlightenment and the postmodernism to be addressed. These postmodern criticisms also open another question with respect to the ideas and how they're actually put to practice. This is another thing that you point out in your book, the relation between ideals and practice. You claim that the 19th century is to blame for colonialism, Eurocentrism, etc., that these ideas are not to be found in the original thinkers of the Enlightenment, which made me think about the reception in which the original idea does not remain pure, the misinterpretations and the abuses of certain ideas. Can we say that the Enlightenment ideas were received in the 19th century in a corrupted form, serving to justify, for example, colonial dominance? What does this tell us about the reception of ideas in general, about the historical flows of thought? It may suggest that it is unpredictable what will be adopted and in which context, that an emancipatory ideal can be degraded into a totalitarian ideology in a new context, raising the question of whether anything of the original ideal remains in this degraded form. When put to practice, ideas can have unintended consequences that undermine and negate the original idea itself. Should the creator of an idea be held responsible for its abuse and misrepresentation in practice? Is Rousseau to be blamed for the reign of terror? Some authors mentioned in your book seem to think that he is. This touches on a deeper question, the relationship between ideas and their implementation. Actual practice always introduces unpredictable deviations, sometimes negative, sometimes positive ones. For example, reforms bringing education to the broader population may be considered a positive deviation from the original Enlightenment ideas, at least deviation from some of the Enlightenment thinkers. I think that when thinking about the reception of a heritage, it is particularly important to think through these deviations from the original ideas, especially today when it appears that the global hyper-circulation of ideas fosters both increased exchange and more frequent clashes of worldviews. This dynamic creates an ambivalent potential. On the one hand, it facilitates the spread of ideas related to human rights, democracy, and equality. On the other, it promotes the proliferation of conspiracy theories, echo chambers, etc. Consequently, we observe more clashes of perspectives and worldviews, overshadowing the potential for cosmopolitan exchange and mutual learning. Moreover, it increases the potential for miscommunications and misunderstandings. As you delineate in your book, the Enlightenment serves as a guide, and it should become even more of a beacon in times of disorientation. However, we should also anticipate formidable counterforces and misinterpretations, similar to how the 19th century manipulated Enlightenment ideas. Still, I would like to conclude on the positive note. I think your book truly is an important reminder of the power of ideas to change the world for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And our final speaker for this block is Natasha Schmale. Natasha, please.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank for the opportunity to be here, to participate in this event. And certainly I have discovered a lot through your book. I say discovered, not learned, because I'm certain I will be able to memorize only a small part of this valuable knowledge you presented in here in this book. So my comment will be rather brief. And even though you said and showed that enlightenment is a global phenomenon, I will have to stick with the part on the relation between enlightenment, the Western civilization, and totalitarianism. So I would like to share some dilemmas which have arisen while I was reading your book. So in the conclusion of your book, you argue in favor of a concept of enlightenment as a science of life, as I understood it, and to cite, which in the light of the theorem of the axial age represents a temporal segment from the suprahistorical or supraepochal phenomenon named enlightenment. So as I understood it, and please correct me if I understood it wrongly, your position is that enlightenment is a suprahistorical phenomenon which is, to put in these words, enriched with humanist ideals as they are defined in 18th century enlightenment. So you refer to Jaspers' theory, but also to Pinka as a good example which illustrates the view that we are constantly moving towards a better world. In that sense, you share a kind of optimist view on enlightenment. So I was wondering how totalitarianism is perceived from this theoretical viewpoint. As I recall, actually I wrote the page 349, Serbian translation, you say that to cite the worst crimes, crimes against humanity, happened after enlightenment. So the attempts to put partial guilt to enlightenment were not convincing. And on another place also, on a couple of places, others, in the chapter on Adorno and Horkheimer also, you mentioned that enlightenment should be understood primarily in the sense of an epoch, namely the 18th century, as I understood. So it seems to me that when you argue that totalitarianism happened after enlightenment, you refer to enlightenment primarily as something related to an epoch, epoche, namely the 18th century. But in the conclusion of your book, you argue in the favor of a suprahistorical concept of enlightenment. So this is what put me actually in a dilemma, and I'm not entirely sure if I understood how do you perceive totalitarianism. So obviously it is not a product of enlightenment, as you mentioned, Is it regression? Is it something which leaps out of the process of enlightenment? So these are some questions which have arisen. So an example, as it is well known, Adorno and Horkheimer, in their representation of the dialectics of enlightenment, highlighted the regressive moments of enlightenment, and that enlightenment should reflect on these regressive moments. That progress led to regress, that is, progress always has kind of a grain of regress in itself. So, and I could name a simple example today, that an example would be today that the technological progress and the sudden rise, of social media has born maybe new forms of alienation, of its estrangement, let's say. We could say that there is some kind of a certain dialectics, and it is somehow in a clash with the view that some humanist ideals, as autonomy, freedom, maturity, and so on, that they have been realized. So in that sense, it is not so much then an optimist view on enlightenment as such, and the moment of enlightenment, the movement of enlightenment is also not seen as something which is solely progressive. So when we talk about Adorno and Horkheimer, so in the context of the 20th century, they tried to find a possible explanation of the rise of fascism, and they referred to this unreflected view on enlightenment, that there is a certain dialectic which should be disclosed, and which could be a possible explanation why humanity has fallen back into barbarianism. So not to go further into this, so totalitarianism, according to this view, is a form of regression, which has to be understood in the light of the dialectics of enlightenment. But going back now to the crucial question, if enlightenment is perceived as a suprahistorical phenomenon, in the light of the theorem of the axial age, can there be given a possible explanation of totalitarianism? Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Professor Schmale, you can now respond.
Yeah, thank you very much for your pertinent remarks and the dense lecture of the book. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's very enlightening what you said. I think a problem which I cannot resolve in the book is, and Soban, you remarked it, the research on the global enlightenment, global history of enlightenment in the 18th century or later is a little bit more than only in the beginning, but it is not the same as the research on European enlightenment. Yeah, though you have a huge library with articles and books on this, and you have a small library concerning enlightenment in India, China, etc., etc. So this is what I cannot resolve in the book, and the problem remains open. So this is, of course, a problem, and you have put your finger in in this one. How to bring it together? Or the Enlightenment has something to do with totalitarianism, or it has not. Yeah. So what is the decision? I come in the end of the book to this axis theory because, first of all, it originates in the 18th century. One of the responsibles is Anquetil Duperron, who stays for many years in India. And his stay in India brings him to say that there is no European specificity in history, but the world, as to say in very simple words, is one, and the civilizational development is a global one and not simply a European one. So, and this is the starting point in the 18th century. And very late comes Jasper after the Second World War, who uses the precise term Achsenzeit and axis theory. And he tries to show that this axial time starts in the antiquity, so in our periodization system, 8th century to 2nd century before Christ, as well in China, other Asian countries, and Europe. And of course, he had not in mind the Americas, because research on the prehistoric Central and South America was not so performant at his time. And after I only quote Schmale and Eisenstadt with this huge and over long years project to the history of the actual age, and he comes with his colleagues into the Middle Ages. And I pose a question now. They stopped because it was ended, the project, but we must think it further. I believe when the axis theory is right for the antiquity, for the global antiquity, and when it's in a continuous manner right for the Middle Ages, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, it does not end with this. So we must think it further. And this would need research about the continuation of the Axial Age in the early modern period until the Enlightenment. And then we can put it together with research we have about Enlightenment in India, China, and so on. But this is an open field, which I cannot answer myself. I'm convinced that this theory has something right in it, because the exchange, as you mentioned, the cultural transfer research, the exchange between these, as to say, regions and land masses, including Northern Africa, never stopped. So it changed, but it never stopped. So there was an intellectual exchange. Sometimes we have not the primary sources, but we can see the results. And the results cannot be explained only by European culture. Yeah? This is a result of cultural transfer, of cultural exchange, of translation processes in a double sense of the word, etc., etc. When this is true, Enlightenment to some extent, and there I agree, is part of our history until today, and that means it's also part of totalitarianism. When you look on it on a more formal, on the form or formal definition of Enlightenment, as Horkheim and Adorno do, they start with Odysseus, not with the Enlightenment. They start with Odysseus. And in philosophy, so in the philosophical handbooks of the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, there's always a chapter of the Attic Enlightenment. There are chapters of the medieval Enlightenment and so on. So there is a general philosophical term which can be used for a certain approach to human and natural life. And this is with what Horkheim and Adorno start. And then I think they pose a problem, because in the chapter on the Enlightenment, the 18th century, they combine Kant, Descartes, and Nietzsche. I often read this chapter, but I don't think it's convincing. This is a break in the argumentation, which once again I cannot resolve. That's a philosophical problem. Maybe we can discuss it a bit later. So these are general problems, philosophical problems, problems of definition. We have, I don't know, hundreds of definitions what the Enlightenment is. And every year we have a dozen or 2 dozens of new definitions of what the Enlightenment is, but we do not advance with this. There is a lot of things to do. And I hope that I say it clear enough in the book that this remains to be resolved with further research. So this is for the general problem of the approach, which is not rounded, but at least research is also to say where the problems are. Now, the question, what is the historical place of the Enlightenment? What do we today with the Enlightenment? I think there is a dynamic starting with the end of the 18th century with the revolutions and the constitutionalism. And today, so when we look or when we criticize democratic states, you have quoted Piketty and Gijón, etc. Yeah, they are right. But I think we have constitutions, democratic constitutions, which are in a tradition from the 19th century to today. They have been reformed, amended, etc. And this is our rule. So it is nonsense to go back or to say, read, please, Rousseau, etc. This might be inspiring, but we have to amend a constitution, of course. But the rules which are violated in political life, in international law, etc., this is a result of constitutions, of national constitutions and international law as created by the United Nations, etc. So this is the measure, and there are deposed the rules to which the states should conform and not to the Enlightenment. And I think sometimes the discussion is wrong. To read Enlightenment texts of the 18th century or 17th century or early 19th century is almost inspiring, but it's not the answer to the problems. The answer is our constitutions, national and international ones, and the amendments of those constitutions. That's our problem we have to solve, and it's not Rousseau, Kant, Voltaire, or Serpocci II who will give us the answer to this. So to be aware of the historical roots, this is necessary, but it's not the answer. And for me, that's the place of the Enlightenment, to historicize it. Well, what I do here, or try to do, we have to historicize the Enlightenment. It's in our history, yes, of course, but it's not the answer we have to give today to our problems and problems in the world. Now, the famous quotation marks. In the German edition, that's right, I put Aufklärung in quotation marks. I did it because in present German, Aufklärung, the significance depends on the context. It can be sexual Aufklärung, it can be military Aufklärung, it can be the Aufklärung of secret services, and you normally use only Aufklärung. So when I put it on a book, which is not only for historians and a narrow circle of researchers, but for academic public at least, I thought when I only write history of the Enlightenment in the global era, what will people think about the word Aufklärung? When I was young, of course, we knew the Aufklärung, that's the Aufklärung of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, but you cannot take it for sure today. So I thought it's better to put it quotation marks so that people have to think about why is this word in quotation marks. Now it's an interesting problem, how to bring it into Serbian or another language. Do we need it or not? Can this lead to misunderstandings or not? I think it's a huge problem, but it's a fascinating problem. How to bring it in another language in an adequate form so that we read and speak about the same problems. Yeah, but this is part of the discussion. I mean, if you can discuss it here, for instance, this brings us further in the results about the Enlightenment, at least the Serbian Enlightenment. Yes, it's right. I don't write it in the book, but you have seen it. That so I combine several decades of research and, as to say, in ever new ways, the Enlightenment came back to me, and I restarted my approach to the Enlightenment. This is in the book. I don't know whether this is really a good strategy or whether it hinders the understanding of the book. At least, thank you very much for your pertinent comments.
And thank you, Professor Schmale, for your responses. Now we'll have a 10-minute break. There are drinks and refreshments there, and 10 past half 6 will continue. Thank you. I hope you had a nice break. We'll now continue with our second block of interventions. We'll have 2 speakers. First, Igor Cveic, Senior Research Fellow here at the Institute. And after him, Ivan Kostic, who's also a Research Fellow here at the Institute. So, Igor, please.
Thank you, Professor Schmale, for this really interesting book and exceptional historical reading of the influence of enlightenment and enlightenment itself. I will start with one of the quotations from Moses Mendelssohn's work about question, what is enlightenment, that you quoted. So Mendelssohn said, Bildung, education, is composed of culture and enlightenment. Culture appears to be more oriented toward practical matters, toward goodness, refinement, and beauty in the arts and social mores. Objectively, toward fertility, diligence, and dexterity in the arts, and inclinations, dispositions, and habits in social mores subjectively. And then enlightenment, in contrast, seems to be more related to theoretical matters, to rational knowledge objectively, and to facility in rational reflection about matters of human life according to their importance and influence on the translated destiny of man, Mendelssohn used Bestimmung des Menschen, subjectively. A bit later on, language attains enlightenment through the science and attains culture through social intercourse, poetry, and eloquence. Through the former, it becomes better suited for theoretical usages, through the later for practical usages. So, of course, Mendelssohn sees the ideal situation then that in education of a nation, these two things come to agreement, so that culture relates to enlightenment of a nation. But nevertheless, we could, Mendelssohn's words, make the at least analytical distinction between enlightenment and the culture. What I see as impression when reading the particularly influence of enlightenment in modern societies, that we usually and mostly speak about culture of enlightenment. It's very much quoted concept in a book that we speak about culture of enlightenment, and influence on a political institution, on the idea of democracy, which is here related obviously to social intercourse and social relations rather than to theoretical usage of the concept. Despite being aware that your thesis argue for the plurality of enlightenment, I came here to the two questions from a neutral standpoint, that we could speak of enlightenment in terms of theoretical usage. And in that sense, we can understand enlightenment as related to science, to truth, in a sense that the main idea of enlightenment is to uncover, recover, and discover the truth, and to use usage of reason, or dare to think Ethereum can, but obviously not directly in a sense of a cultural social relation, but before all in relations to science. And probably not accident that most popular people on Wikipedia is Isaac Newton. When we can have this perspective, is it probably interesting to treat two different influences of culture of enlightenment, or enlightenment on our culture and social relation, and influence of enlightenment on our relations to theoretical issues, to the idea of knowledge, idea of truth, relation to science. Because I think there are probably two different influences nowadays, particularly in relation to Olga's comment about postmodern. And from the second perspective, if we take that Mendelssohn is right, that we could specify that what is specific about enlightenment is theoretical usage, then we came to the question, could we treat enlightenment and the influence of enlightenment as the culture of enlightenment, but without relation to its core, which is mostly related to what is sometimes called philosophical idea of enlightenment, and that is its theoretical usage. So when we speak about heritage, cultural heritage of enlightenment, and I see that, for example, Declaration of Human Rights, the idea of democracies came to the part of culture of enlightenment, or enlightenment treated as a culture and not as a type related to Bildung, and education or theoretical usage of our own mind and idea of uncovering the true knowledge or whatever, would, if we presuppose that this is right, the definition of enlightenment, together with Mendelssohn, could we actually take up that influence on culture without these core ideas of enlightenment? Would be appropriate way to claim how much enlightenment influence nowadays, because it is not saying that we came to adopt the culture of enlightenment which relates to the ideas of enlightenment and to adopt the core of idea of enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Ivan, you have the word.
So I'll just, oops. Okay, I think it's, I hope that everyone hears me. Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me and having me here and to discuss this about this intriguing book by Professor Schmale. And during my brief reflection, I will stick to issues exclusively concerned with my academic expertise, and that is Islamic studies and the history of Islamic civilization. So in short reflection, I will try to look at the most important encounters between Europe and the predominantly Muslim world, and at the time when the Enlightenment had already gained momentum in Europe. And but what is most important, I will try to provide a modest answer to Professor Schmale's question in his book that he's raising. This is in several places in his book. Does Islamic Enlightenment exist, or does it exist today? So the most important encounter between Europe and the Muslim world in this context that we are today debating is period is undoubtedly the year 1798, when the France led by Napoleon conquered Egypt. Even though France will only stay in Egypt for 3 years, its presence will leave a significant mark on the intellectual elites of Arab Muslim world, who until then still primarily lived in the belief that the Arab Islamic world was, if not leading world civilization, then certainly at the very top. It is extremely interesting, and I remember clearly when we were at the studies and reading the writings of Al-Azhar ulema, religious scholars from that period, and other classical texts dealing with this period. Through them, you could see clearly the degree of the disbelief and shock and fear that was present among them due to the realization that the Muslim world was not anymore at the forefront of global civilization, but was facing considerable challenges. You are, Professor Schmale, mentioning this all in your book, the situation, the Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, and this situation inspired Muhammad Ali to send Egyptian students first educational mission to Europe in the 1820s. Among them was Rifa Rafa Tahtawi, who also you are mentioning in the book, born in 81 when the French left Egypt. Tahtawi will discover a whole new world. In Paris, he will get acquainted with the works of the leading French thinkers of that time, especially Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Etienne Bezout, which he will translate into Arabic soon after returning to Egypt. With Tahtawi's return to Egypt, the Nahda or Renaissance, the awakening movement, began in the Arab Muslim world, not the whole Muslim world, but Arab Muslim world. And here, just one small intervention. I don't know if the translation in the book is wrong or accurate, but Nahda does not mean the Enlightenment. That is, you are correctly afterwards mentioning the term Tanwir. But the Nahda means Renaissance or awakening, and that was just that enabled the birth of the Tanwir. So Nahda still wasn't fully inspired, or let's say by the Enlightenment, fully what will afterwards happen in the Arab Muslim world. Parallel to this, you are not, unfortunately, many people neglect what was going on, the similar developments in Indian subcontinent with Sir Said Ahmed Khan and the establishment of Aligarh University this is very important connection, because through this connection, because the Brits were in the Indian subcontinent, the Muslim thinkers there in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, what are today, they became familiar with the English-speaking Enlightenment thinkers, and Sir Ahmed Khan translated a lot of work of the English Enlightenment thinkers into Urdu. So the introduction of of European thinkers to the Muslim world through Arabic and Urdu translations sparked a wave of intellectual transformation, leading to the emergence of various schools of thought. Among the most significant, and this you are mentioning, the Tanvir school of thought, Enlightenment school of thought, then Islahi, reformist thought, renewal, Tajdidi, Ihya, revivalist school of thought, and so on. Each of these schools represented a distinct response to the new ideas and principles introduced to the Muslim world through the works of European thinkers. Of course, here I will definitely not tackle all of these schools, but they are very important because every of these schools have their own response and relationship toward the Enlightenment, but I will concentrate exclusively on the Tanviri and Tanviriyun thinkers, that is, those who advocated Enlightenment ideas and principles. It is most important to point out that this school of thought members were primarily Christians. Farah Antoun, a Lebanese Christian who lived and worked in Egypt and engaged in vigorous public debates about secularism, for example, with Mohammed Abduh, the most important Islamic thinker of the late 19th and early 20th century. Then there were Faris al-Shidyak and Boutros al-Bustani, both Maronite Christians from Lebanon, who were very vocal in spreading national ideas, not only Arab, but already back then, Lebanese and Syrian national ideas. And finally, a Coptic Christian from Egypt, Salama Musa, who wrote perhaps the most significant book in the context of Enlightenment, Ma Hiya Tanwir, or that means in translation to English, what is Enlightenment? Here it is crucial to know that all the mentioned thinkers who were vocal advocates and bearers of the ideas of Enlightenment in the Arab Muslim world were actually, or let's say predominantly, Christians, not Muslims. This fact is of a great importance if we want to answer the question of whether Islamic Enlightenment exists or existed back then. In this sense, it is essential to distinguish between Islamic, Muslim, and what Marshall Hodgson called Islamic Aid in his seminal 3-volume work, The Venture of Islam. Hodgson uses Islamic Aid to refer to the complex social and cultural practices, literature, art forms, and traditions that have developed in the Islamic world, but are not strictly religious or doctrinal. This distinction allows us to differentiate between what is specifically Islamic and what is part of the broader cultural sphere and atmosphere influenced by Islam and other religions, cultures, traditions, and encounters with all of those, but not necessarily a product of the specific religious doctrine, in this case, Islamic. On the above grounds, we can conclude that although Tanvir's school of thought did develop in the Islamic world, as we have already said, its main barriers were Christian Arabs or a few secular Muslims who were strongly influenced by Western thought and received their education in Europe, like famous and prolific thinker Abdul al-Razik. Only a few Islamic scholars entirely accepted Enlightenment and its epistemological framework, which does not mean that specific ideas of Enlightenment did not leave their mark on Islamic thinkers in the way they reflected on specific topics and ideas. This primarily concerns endeavors to motivate Islamic scholars in a manner akin to the Enlightenment to foster intellectual and moral accountability, along with an unwavering commitment to pursuit of truth. However, in the end, we can conclude that even in this case, we can just talk about a functional rather than substantial common ground with Islamic epistemic virtues and Enlightenment ideals, where conflicts may arise not from the call for reason and rational justification, but from the particular understanding of these concepts within each framework. Having said all of this, you were referring, Professor Schmale, predominantly to the work of Reinhard Schulz and his idea of Islamic enlightenment. And Reinhard Schulz was and still is a giant in the Islamic studies. But nevertheless, his theory, or let's his thesis of Islamic enlightenment was heavily critiqued by many experts in Islamic studies, such, first of all, as Dutch Islamologist Rudolf Peters, who you are, I think that you're also referring to him in one footnote, and German Orientalist Bernhard Radke, who is specialist in Islamic mysticism and Sufism, but many others as well. The essence of this whole critique to the Schulz work is that we should be very cautious about conflating superficial similarities with the Western Enlightenment, as this risk misrepresenting the unique political, social, and economic context of the Islamic world. Such comparisons could dilute the specific meaning of enlightenment, under the quotation mark, and potentially isolate intellectual developments from their broader historical contexts, adopting an overly idealistic perspective of historical progression. Instead of searching for direct analogies to the Western Enlightenment, in my modest opinion, we should advocate appreciating the 18th century on its own term, highlighting its intrinsic dynamism and vitality. We should call for a historiographical approach that acknowledges the era's uniqueness, potentially recognizing its cultural and intellectual developments without forcing them into a Western framework. This perspective not only honors the complexity of Islamic history, but also respects the distinct paths of cultural and intellectual evolution within the Islamic world. In other words, a critique of Schulz's approach to the Islamic Enlightenment serves as a caution against oversimplification and Eurocentric comparisons. It underscores the importance of nuanced, context-aware historiography that seeks to understand the Islamic world's 18th century in its complexity without imposing external frameworks that might obscure more than reveal. And now, just briefly in the very end, just a few words about the maybe contemporary stance of Islamic thinkers and how they see the Enlightenment and its possible legacies. So while Enlightenment thinkers today advocate for liberty and equality, these ideals are unfortunately very often limited to Western European men, excluding indigenous people and enslaved people around the globe. Islamic thinkers today point out to the paradox of liberty, what they call, this is a quotation mark, where Enlightenment ideals justified both the quest for freedom and democratic governance in Europe and the Americas, but in the same time, the oppressive colonial and slave system in non-Western lands. Having this in mind, Islamic thinkers argue for a critical examination of these contradictions and for the realization of a more inclusive and equitable notion of liberty. In other words, contemporary Islamic scholars argue that modernity itself, as shaped to some degree by the Enlightenment, of course, cannot be disentangled from coloniality. This means that the social, political, and economic advancements attributed to the Enlightenment were made possible by the exploitation and marginalization of non-Western peoples. Because of this, Islamic thinkers for critical engagement with these legacies as well of the Enlightenment to envision and enact alternative modernities that are truly inclusive and just. So I have some other things that I could share about Alastair McIntyre and some other parallel, but you are saying that there aren't alternative modernities that made successful, or let's say showed successful, but yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you, Professor.
Directly, okay, yeah, thank you. We start with Moses Mendelssohn. So I say in the book that I prefer his definition, or not definition, description of enlightenment to the definition of Kant, because Kant, he gives a definition, he says what enlightenment is, and Moses Mendelssohn is more modest, and he says he will describe what enlightenment is. And I prefer his combination, as you have shown. So Bildung is the entire building, as to say, and under this roof we have culture and we have enlightenment, Aufklärung as a process. So to enlighten people or to give maybe it's the same what Giovanna Boradori calls intellectual orientation. So maybe this is in the same streamline of interpreting the Enlightenment. And the reason why I prefer Moses Mendelssohn is the question of a praxis, of a cultural praxis. And I think that most of the Enlightenment first comes into diverse practices. And when you were speaking, I thought about until the first decade after the Second World War, people exactly tried to build something with ideas of alignment directly. So in the end of the Dreyfus affair in the late 19th century in France, the Dreyfusards founded the first League for Human Rights. And with reference to the Declaration of Human Rights and the Rights of Citizens in 1789, and with reference in their debates to Voltaire, Rousseau, and many other enlighteners. So this is a kind of practice where we take these writings and we have fundaments for our idea of a League for Human Rights. And after the Second World War, so we have the generation of politicians in Europe, and in the speeches, Council of Europe, and in other assemblies, they very often refer to the Enlightenment, to concrete Enlightenment thinkers. For instance, the French provisional president of the first assembly of the Council of Europe in 1949, Edouard Herriot, the French one, president of the National Assembly in France, he said, "We wish the Germany of the Enlightenment. With this Germany, we can cooperate after the war, but not with the Germany of National Socialism." So that's another example for the practice, for cultural practice, inspired by Enlightenment in the sense of Moses Mendelssohn. And I think this is a very crucial point in understanding the Enlightenment. And when we now think further what you have said, what about today? And I think, Olga, this was also a point in your comment. What do people, or what do we today? Do we have a practice of enlightenment, or is just to say, continue the enlightenment, as Steven Pinker says? So he has, I don't know, 100 statistics to show how successful the enlightenment was, and said, let us continue this way. Or others say, okay, we need a renewal of the Enlightenment, but there is nothing new as an intellectual orientation. So maybe the competence to bring Enlightenment into practice has been thrown over and is not to our disposition today. And this would mark a break in the history of Enlightenment. So the description of Moses Mendelssohn gives a lot of ideas to think even about the recent history of the Enlightenment in our century. Now, Islamic Enlightenment and others. Yeah, thank you very much for the clarification of the notions and the difference between Nakhda and Tanwir. In the recent English literature, sometimes a confusion between both terms. And I think it's very important to make clear that this is not the same meaning. These are two terms, not meanings the same. My question back would be, Reinhard Schulze, did you only wish that there had been an Islamic Enlightenment because it was politically correct in the 1990s to see Enlightenment outside Europe? I'm not quite sure because he takes religion as a starting point. But I'm not an expert of the development, religious development in the Islamic society, whether this is comparable with developments in the Christian society, or whether this is comparable with the multi-religious region of the late Mughal Empire in India. I think this is very complicated to say. Maybe I pose this question to you and ask you for an answer.
a great counter-answer question, because you're mentioning, you're quoting this, by the way, this part of the Schultz, how he's defining the Enlightenment, if you remember, where he's saying this, using the religious tradition, I will paraphrase now, so that moving from the theocentric to anthropocentric, but through usage of, let's say religious tradition. So I'm simplifying now for the sake of this debate, but this, if we take this into account, let's say if we use this definition that Schultz proposed, then I think that this is very hard that we say that we have this in Islamic societies. Of course, there were some aspects that Islamic thinkers, and now when I'm saying Islamic, then I'm referring to those who are coming from this, let's say, religious background, and what I make this distinction between Islamicate and Islamic, or let's say Muslim. So the Islamic thinkers, they didn't try to, let's say, dismantle this theocentric worldview. Their idea was that through theocentric worldview, introduce maybe some aspects, or let's say some ideas, and to get into discussion with some ideas of the Enlightenment, and maybe some of them to adopt to them or whatever, but not in the sense that what Schultz is saying, that they were trying to minimize the theocentric in favor of the anthropocentric, and this is the, let's say through reading of this can testify the subsequent developments in the Islamic world, and especially today. So predominantly, you still today, maybe these progressive Islamists or whatever, but they are again from the West, but they're a tiny minority. But among the academic intellectuals in the Muslim world who are the Islamic thinkers, they are definitely not trying to do this. They are not going in that direction. They are still keeping and trying to keep this hardcore, let's say under quotation mark, theocentric worldview, and to develop some kind of answers to the contemporary issues and questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. We'll now transition to our final block. We'll also have two speakers, Predrag Krstic, who is a senior research fellow here at the Institute, and me. Predrag, please.
Thanks, George. I would also like to begin by thanking Professor Schmale for the opportunity to talk about his book, as well as the publisher of the Serbian edition for enabling that such an important work to be read in this language. I will keep my comments general in the hopes of sharing some dilemmas I have long harbored, brought to the surface once again by the history of modern enlightenment. But before all that, a small confessional disclaimer. As you vow not to be a philosopher, but a historian, I must disclose that in my case, it's the other way around. It is probably therefore not entirely clear to me how your background justifies privileging the term social over, say, intellectual framework. After all, there is such a thing as the history of ideas. And it is precisely in the historical interpretation of the Enlightenment, if I have properly understood, that the focus regularly alternated between so-called social history and intellectual history. Is it then fair to say that you place the accent on the former, which is not to say that the later is neglected, but was incorporated above all in the chapter Intellectuals as a public practice into the first? If this is so, however, this has consequences or comes at a cost. The theorist in me cannot help but object to you saying that the phenomenon of enlightening the Enlightenment is not an end in itself, but has a function, helping to constitute social guidelines. That was a quotation. Would it not be sufficiently important, they said primarily so, to eliminate, behind social impact, the dimensions of the Enlightenment, which, although, as you say, was never apolitical, produced devastating and not necessarily creating or even desirable critique, for example. Considering the Enlightenment the social guide, we have already chosen an interpretation of it, a more or less Habermasian one, that it is a theory of managing the emancipatory interest. I do not wish to deny that it is one, perhaps even a dominant aspect, but as you know, how could it apply to, for example, D'Alembert's or Lamettri's or before all of them, Diderot's theories, taking as given that they had something like a consistent theory in the first place. In other words, Enlightenment is here taken above all as a social phenomenon or an intellectual phenomenon that serves as a social guide. Consequently, the reception of the Enlightenment is reduced to waning what is said to be inserted in the subtext of this reception. Democracy, rule of law, human rights, or what we elsewhere call the political, the historically democratic heritage of the Enlightenment. Yet, is this not the impoverishment of those fertile theoretical tensions nurtured by the members of the Enlightenment themselves, along with their philosophers, commentators, even with regard to social theory? I understand the disclaimer of limiting the topic to the quotation again, process of enlightening the Enlightenment as a practice. But I'm less than convinced in that case that the intellectuals who have thematized it have not only been instrumentalized by subsuming their intellectual endeavor into public practice, but perhaps even betrayed and falsified given their own intentions. Indeed, given the focus on social guideline, the exclusion of the contra-enlightenment is tactically understandable, yet on a strategic level, it seems that it is problematic at the moment when it comes to determining the very enlightenment. This might sound a little too Schmittian, but it's not untrue. Defoe does indeed determine us. Although well, when we consider the appealing thesis that the Enlightenment itself, in its socially effective and somewhat coherent form, is the result of its enemies as much as its members. We find this in various philosophers, such as Charles Taylor and the brothers Böhme, but also among historians. Chartier suggests that the revolution invented the Enlightenment in an attempt to ground its legitimation, constructing a continuity in search for fatherhood. Even more pointedly, James Smith thinks that the Enlightenment might above all be a creation of its enemies than the other way around, while McMahon is explicit that the idea of Enlightenment was initially constructed as a product of the enemies of that moment, accusing the philosophers for spreading atheism, moral perversion, social disunity, and political disruption. If there is any truth in these reconstructions, which Jonathan Israel, if I remember well, calls a stunning reversal of familiar order, then we could also say that the Enlightenment was always from its historical epoch and not only how it is present to us today, as you say, that is since the Second World War, a narrative construction, which means that its historization was being conducted already in the 18th century and not only starting in 1815 till 1820, as you write. I suspect, however, that you deal with this in your book, The 18th Century, which to my shame, I have not read. The present book shows and proves that the Enlightenment, I quote again, is a construct that has for a long time lived its own life. This is not only justification, but the greatness of your writing. We now have the privilege to reading in excellent translation. A text showing brilliantly the later reception of the historical Enlightenment, as well as the uses and abuses of this really modern and late modern and contemporary code word. I don't want to test everybody's patience anymore, so I'm going to stop here and thank you again.
Predrag. Now, I'll say a couple of words, but since a lot of what I wanted to say has been said already, I'll just be brief as well. I want to ask a simple question, and it's a silly question actually, but who is an Enlightenment thinker? Who counts as an Enlightenment thinker? Now, this might sound very silly, but for example, in your book, you refer to Gertrude Himmelfarb's reading of Edmund Burke, and according to her, he is an Enlightenment thinker, although he is often taken as a critic of the Enlightenment. That made me think you refer at the end of the book to reactionary currents that existed already in the 18th century. And one name I thought of was de Maistre. Could de Maistre be called an Enlightenment thinker? He was in that kind of a time frame, but I would say, no, he's a counter-Enlightenment thinker. But that then puts the question, what happens to Rousseau then, if de Maistre is a counter-Enlightenment thinker? Because they shared some similar views when it comes to enlightening the people. For example, they shared the view that the laws function best when there are no books, there are no philosophy, when enlightenment is not there. And then we could say, okay, Rousseau, he was an Enlightenment thinker, he had enlightened reasons. De Maistre was reprehensible. But then what happens to Voltaire also? Because he also, and I quote, stated that the rebel is not worthy of being enlightened. So a lot of Enlightenment thinkers have, in some way or another, something negative to say about the Enlightenment in different degrees. And this then puts the question of, where do we draw the line between the Enlightenment and the counter-Enlightenment? And if we, as you say, if these names, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, they function today still, for example, in post-colonial context, in emancipatory context as watchwords, as slogans, Voltaire, toleration, Rousseau, sovereignty of the people, Montesquieu, separation of powers. But isn't this kind of a, let us say, social attempt to socially orient enlightenment in a specific emancipatory project, let us say, precisely the kind of simplification and a naive understanding of the Enlightenment that you yourself argue against in your book? You often refer to this simplification, but isn't that precisely this idea that we should socially orient Enlightenment result in a kind of a reductionist reading of the Enlightenment? And I'm not saying, of course, that Enlightenment is anti-democratic, that, as you yourself say, it was very heterogeneous. And I think it is also a problem to draw the line and say, not even to, okay, these thinkers are Enlightenment thinkers, these are counter-Enlightenment. No, the same thinker is problematic. So that is my intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. Let us start with intellectual and or societal orientation. I think it's really worth to be debated. When I read Giovanna Boradori, and she writes in English, not in Italian, so she has chosen for her summary of the interview with Habermas and Derrida, intellectual orientation. And as I'm a historian, I was thinking about what is intellectual orientation. And then I looked to the practices of the Enlightenment. In the 18th century, in the book 18th century, I looked to the Enlightenment in the village. And so the cultural mediators, sometimes merchants, sometimes it's a priest or a bourgeois living in a village, etc., and dealing with wines, who are the cultural mediators and bring their readings into the village assembly, for instance. There are very nice examples in France, and I looked into Saxonia as a comparison between two regions in the 18th century. I looked to these types of practices which continue in the 19th century, and I thought at least intellectual orientation might concern more the individual, so also the self-education or education in school by reading texts, discussing them, or learning about the authors, and social processes or societal processes in which the Enlightenment plays a role in one sense or in another. And finally, as a historian and to some extent social historian, I decided to take as a keyword societal orientation, not to negate intellectual orientation, but to put the finger on social processes or societal, as it's said now, and less on individual processes. Of course, the examples of the resistance in the Second World War, this is very individual affair by reading Enlightenment thinkers and to have an inspiration for fighting against the dictatorship, etc. This is a very individual and to some extent intimate process, and this is of course intellectual orientation. This just to put a little bit the social perspective or societal perspective more in the focus than it's normally done. So this is the background of my decision to take this sketchwork and not intellectual orientation. Now, but I think both comments, what is in common is really the question what the Enlightenment was, and it starts with a decision who is an Enlightenment thinker and who is not. So we have it with the Islamic Enlightenment, or with thinkers or intellectuals in India and the Mughal Empire, or in North Africa. Are they Enlightenment thinkers, or what they are? They are not, or they are. I have chosen a formal approach. First of all, I looked in international encyclopedias of the Enlightenment, 4 volumes. So who is in? Which persons are in this and declared as Enlightenment thinkers or enlighteners? And then I checked these names, for about 200. I checked these names in Wikipedia. What do these articles say? Of course, normally some articles are written by academics, of course, but it's not a reference point for research, of course. But when in Wikipedia and 40 million people read this article, it is said this person is an Enlightenment thinker, he or she is. So we can for a long time discuss whether this is appropriate or not. This is the mass which decides who is Enlightenment and who is not Enlightenment. So this is a formal approach which I followed, and I avoided to give the answer you request from me. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to have your opinion on this, whether this is an acceptable method to proceed when you go in the wide world with your questions. I have my doubts myself, of course, but I've taken this decision and it's now on the table for critique. So what would you say how to proceed with this problem? For me, Berg, how to say, the structure of his argumentation, this is 18th century, and this is Enlightenment. Yes, he has not the same position as Rousseau, but this is Enlightenment, of course. And after the Second World War, the first English speaker in the Council of Europe, they, of course, referred to Burke and other English thinkers, not you, but Edmund Burke. And they called it Enlightenment. Yeah, that's just an example.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I agree that yes, yeah, no, but I agree in the sense that we just have to accept what has been like generally, well, decided who belongs to what. But the question goes at the heart of philosophical problems that the Enlightenment thinkers themselves were grappling with. So, for example, the relationship between political power and knowledge, or between enlightenment and the structure of society, and so on and so forth. That's why I refer to de Maistre, Rousseau. And I think that when we look at their texts, the situation is much more complicated. And as you say, we come to this very heterogeneous field, which is not simply different figures with different ideas, but actually one figure who is all over place. So I think the best way to see the Enlightenment itself is as well, it's kind of a clash of forces, and a struggle and an exchange of ideas. But in this kind of a historical approach, then to say that okay, this is the image that we should construct. I mean, this is the whole point of your book, the way Enlightenment has been constructed throughout the decades. But I think that the philosophical approach on this, which is on this, let us say, the same level as what the Enlightenment thinkers themselves would do. So we decide to grapple with their ideas, is in tension with this historical, and even more so when this historical approach has an explicit purpose, which is to provide it with a political orientation, which is completely legitimate. I would say both approaches are legitimate for their own different purposes. So I really can't decide and say no, that's I don't want to exclude or reduce from one position the other position. I think it's important to see them both. That would be my answer. But thank you everyone for participating. The seminar. Thank to all the speakers. Thank you, audience, for still being with us here. And of course, thank you, Professor Schmale, for being our guest and for giving us this opportunity to talk about these important and interesting ideas. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.